The opposing party tonight will be Tim Wise. Wise has spoken in 48 states and on over 400 college campuses, including Harvard, Stanford, and the law schools at Yale and Columbia. Wise has provided anti-racism training to teachers nationwide and has conducted trainings with physicians and medical industry professionals on how to combat racial inequities in healthcare. He has also trained corporate, government, military, and law enforcement officials on methods for dismantling racism in their institutions. And he has served as a consultant for plaintiffs' attorneys in federal discrimination cases in New York and Washington State. In the summer of 2005, Wise served as the adjunct faculty member at the Smith College School for Social Work in Northampton, Massachusetts, where he co-taught a master's level course on racism in the U.S. In September 2001, Wise served as faculty in residence at Poynter Institute in St. Petersburg, Florida, where he trained journalists to eliminate racial bias in reporting. From 1999 to 2003, Wise was an advisor to Fisk University Race Relations Institute, and in the early 1990s was Associate Director of the Louisiana Coalition Against Racism and Nazism. Wise is the author of White Like Me, Reflections on Race from a Privileged Son, which will be for sale after the proceedings tonight, and Affirmative Action, Racial Preference in Black and White. He has contributed essays to 15 books and is featured in White Man Challenging Racism, 35 Personal Stories. Wise has a BA in Political Science from Tulane University, where his anti-apartheid work received global attention and the thanks from Nelson Mandela and Archbishop Desmond Tutu. He received training in methods for dismantling racism from People's Institute for Survival and Beyond in New Orleans. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Tim Wise.
I am going to do something I rarely do, and that is begin my presentation with a quote from someone I rarely quote, for reasons that will become readily apparent to you, because his name is Ronald Reagan. In 1974, in the waning days of his administration as the governor of the state of California, Ronald Reagan said something that for him was amazingly profound, but which in fact was probably profound no matter who it had come from. He said, "Time and experience have shown that laws and edicts of non-discrimination are not enough. Justice demands that each and every citizen consciously adopt and accentuate a real and personal commitment to affirmative action so as to make equal opportunity a reality." And he said these things as he signed into law the very affirmative action programs which were deemed racial preferences by Proposition 209, the California Civil Rights Initiative, on which the Michigan Civil Rights Initiative is based, signed into law the very programs which he may not have viewed as racially preferential and others might not, but nonetheless they were struck down as a result of Prop 209. That Ronald Reagan understood in 1974, what Dr. Cohen fails to understand in 2006, is so interesting that it literally boggles my mind. Because what Reagan was saying was that it wasn't enough to say no discrimination. I mean, that's simple. That's the wording of the MCRI. And if life were that easy, we would not have to have debates such as this. We would not have to have a court to interpret what laws mean, because it would be obvious to everyone. The fact that the wording sounds so pretty and so nice and so beautiful disregards the fact that the interpretation of what constitutes illegitimate racial preference will not be in the eyes of necessarily me, certainly not necessarily in the eyes of Dr. Cohen or anyone in this room, but will be left open to legislative pronouncements and ultimately court decisions. Dr. Cohen would like you to believe and accept that you won't heal racism by giving racial preferences. I will suggest to you that you will also never heal racism by allowing the continuation of existing systematic and institutionalized white racial supremacy and privilege and preference in this country. And unless we are prepared to have that discussion, we ought not be here. Now, this morning I read your student paper and I noticed a quote from Dr. Cohen, which may well have been a misquote, because God knows I have been misquoted in more papers than I care to recount. But what he said was that if MCRI is passed, what that will mean, and this sounds lovely, is that everyone in Michigan will be treated equally. Now that is a lovely sentiment, although utterly false, because of course, It ignores the profound inequalities of opportunity that have been institutionalized in this state and which remain, and not only in this state, but in this nation, and the way in which those systematic preferences for white Americans, much like myself, would persist and indeed would be untouched by the Michigan Civil Rights Initiative. In fact, they would be cemented and locked further into place by the passage of that initiative, because the initiative would eliminate virtually any targeted effort to provide access and opportunity to those who, through no fault of their own, have been both historically and contemporaneously denied equal access both here and throughout this country of ours. The history of America, whether we want to acknowledge it or not, and of course we don't, is the history of racial preference for my people. It is the history of affirmative action for my people. Whether we are talking about the Naturalization Act of 1790, the very first law passed by the Congress of the United States before they did anything else after the Constitution was ratified, was passed this law, which said free white persons and only free white persons could be citizens. So whether we're talking about that or the Homestead Act of 1862, which allowed whites and virtually only whites to get up to 160 acres of land for $10 down and nothing else, and people of color, by and large, couldn't access it. Whether we're talking about that, or whether we're talking about segregation, or whether we're talking about the government-underwritten, government-subsidized, government-guaranteed FHA and VA loans for housing that in the middle of this past century just ended allowed whites and virtually no one who wasn't white in this state or in any other to obtain low-cost housing. The creation of the white middle class made possible on the backs of those government programs, which, if they had benefited black people, we would have called them welfare, but because they benefited white people, we called it good macroeconomic policy. And as a result of the ability of whites and almost only whites to accumulate wealth, at a time that people of color were certainly not allowed to do the same in this state and others, as Carl would acknowledge readily and essentially does in his opening statement, as a result of that, the average white family, I do not mean the average wealthy white family, I mean the average white family in this country and indeed in Michigan, has an average net worth of 14 times the average net worth of the typical black family, 11 times the average of the typical Latino family, not because we have worked harder, not because we are more qualified, not because we are in some sense more moral or ethical or anything of that nature, of course, but because of the accumulation of intergenerational preference and privilege and advantage. And here's the point. None of that will go away if you vote for the Michigan Civil Rights Initiative, because it is sedimented in the history of your state and this country. And unless there are programs and specific policies intended to open access and opportunity to those who did not get in on all that affirmative action, who did not get in on all that racial preference, then that system will remain in place. We will not get rid of racial privilege or preference. We will simply get rid of those policies intended to balance out institutionalized supremacy and domination. How we can call that just because it seems fair on its face, because it says we're going to treat everyone neutrally, but the horses are already out of the barn, as the saying goes. And so to treat each other neutrally now is to ignore what even Ronald Reagan understood in 1974. But of course, it's not just history. I mean, if it were, we could, consign this discussion to a history class. The reality is those racial preferences and privileges for whites continue today, and they too will not be touched by the passage of the MCRI. They'll remain in place. So, for example, the Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs, these are the folks who actually monitor compliance with affirmative action, and for that matter, most other civil rights laws that apply to contractors and companies, have reported that up to 75%, 3 out of 4 companies and contractors in this country that are covered by affirmative action law are in massive violation of those laws in terms of their ongoing discrimination against not white people, but people of color. The problem is the OFCCP only has 4,600 monitors, because we as a country don't think this is a budget priority. They have 4,600 people. That's enough monitors to check up on each company and contractor once every 46 years and make sure they're not breaking the law. If we want to end racial preference and privilege, you shouldn't vote for the MCRI. You should demand of your legislators, your senator, and your president that they triple, quadruple, quintuple, increase by 10 or 20 or 100 times the number of monitors whose job it is to root out ongoing discrimination against folks of color, because that is what all of the evidence, not some, all of the evidence suggests is still happening. A study 2 years ago finds that persons with white-sounding names applying for jobs are 50% more likely to get callbacks for interviews than people with black-sounding names, even when all other credentials and qualifications are the same. This is important. Number one, it demonstrates ongoing discrimination against peoples of color, which will not stop if you pass the MCRI. It will simply limit access to public sector jobs that might balance some of that out. But it also disproves any silliness about reverse discrimination that people would like us to believe, because let's face it, if reverse discrimination were a common phenomenon in the job market, if indeed it paid to be black, if indeed you got goodies and racial preference because you were black, this study would have been the perfect study to prove it, because they had the names right in front of them. You can imagine yourself in the position of the personnel director who goes to the post office that morning and picks up the envelope and rips it open and sees the resume and says, "Hot damn, Tamika has applied for the job. Why, we must hire Tamika." And what do you say, Jamal is in the house? Oh, hell yes, we must hire Jamal. But now, what's her name? Oh, no, Mindy? Oh, hell no. Chloe? Oh, hell no. Skylar? Get out of here with Skylar. I know she's a white girl. And that's what they could have done. That's what they could have done, and that's what they would have done if, in fact, racial preference for people of color were the norm in the labor market, but they did not. Those who were simply suspected of being white, haven't even been found guilty of this thing yet, merely suspected of it, had a 50% greater chance of getting a call back. And then the next year, a study finds that white men with a criminal record are slightly more likely to get a call back for a job interview than black men without one, even when they have exactly the same credentials, qualification, dress, demeanor, speech styles, etc. That is the face of racial preference. But even more than that, the National Center for Career Strategy says that as much as 85% of the jobs in this country aren't advertised at all. They're filled by networking, they're filled by word of mouth, who you know, not what you know. That's not going to end if you pass the MCRI, just like it didn't end when you passed the Civil Rights Act. In the absence of affirmative action, and not just on the books, but enforced, which it often has not been in this country for the past 15 or as much as 20 years in most places, without that as a counterbalance to those old boys networks that disproportionately exclude folk of color and women of all colors on a gender level, and for that matter, working class folks of all races, right? Without those kinds of programs and efforts, that kind of privilege and preference will remain. 91% of all government contracts in this state and this nation are given to companies owned by white male businesses, not because they are smarter, not because they submit lower bids. And even if they did submit lower bids, how many white male-owned companies have to rip off the government before we get wise to the fact that just because you say it's going to cost X doesn't mean that you mean it's going to cost X. And if you're Halliburton or so-and-so, you can get more and more and more and more and more contracts, no matter how dishonest you may be. See, if we were really giving out contracts on the basis of merit, there'd be a lot of white male-owned companies that wouldn't get any contracts anymore. But it's not about merit. It's about networks. It's about who you know. It's about the folks that are in your little coterie of friends. The MCRI isn't going to change that, because a lot of that is very subtle. A lot of that is not overt. A lot of that is not blatant. Now, Carl wrote a book called Naked Racial Preference. He does not like naked racial preference, but he doesn't appear to have as much of a problem with cloaked racial preference. That is to say, the racial preference which does not advertise itself as such, but which nonetheless has that effect. So in Michigan, for example, where so much misunderstanding exists about what the University of Michigan was and wasn't doing prior to the Supreme Court decision in June of '03 that threw out the undergraduate plan. Oh, we heard about the naked racial preference. We heard about the 20 points on a 150-point scale that underrepresented minorities, Black, Latino, and American Indian folks would get, and we said that was unfair. But now, there were some other preferences within that point system which had the effect, whether intended or not, had the effect of preferencing whites, and no one, including Carl Cohen, said anything. So if you were from the Upper Peninsula, God love you, you got 16 additional points on the 150-point scale just because you're from the right part of the state. That has nothing to do with merit. And I would also point out that I doubt, I've been to Ann Arbor several times, Carl's been there longer than I, but I would bet that neither of us have seen any members of the Upper Peninsula residency walking around Ann Arbor going, oh my God, I hope they don't find out I'm from Ann Arbor. I mean, excuse me, from Traverse City or above, or whatever the hell the UP is. I hope they don't find out. I hope they don't find out that I'm from that really cold northern region, because then they'll question my competence. But that's what he says black folks suffer every day. That black folks are suffering not because of racism, but affirmative action. Which, if that were true, then members of the Upper Peninsula should be suffering some horrible stigma. Oh my God, they're going to think I'm less qualified. And of course, who are the folks getting the UP preference? I mean, I haven't been there, but I've done a little homework, and I know the snow is not the only thing that is white in the Upper Peninsula. So that when you give a geographic preference to the UP, you are indeed extending cloaked, not naked, but cloaked racial preference. You get 4 points if daddy went to the University of Michigan, or granddaddy, or mom. And of course, over 90% of alumni preferences go to white folks, because that's whose parents and grandparents had access. If you went to one of the state's top high schools, right, you get 10 points. That seems race neutral in theory, but in practice it's not, because of the ongoing residential de facto segregation and school segregation. You may not know this, but the Harvard Civil Rights Project reported 3 years ago that this state, not the South where I'm from, but this state has the highest rate of segregated schools of any state in the United States. And so when you give preference to people who went to the best schools, you're giving cloaked but quite real racial preference, and I should point out class preference, to white folks who are mostly affluent. If you took an AP and honors curriculum throughout your junior and senior year, you got 8 points. Seems fair in theory, but in practice, the schools that serve white students in this state and in this country have on average 3 times as many honors and AP classes offered as the schools that serve mostly students of color. So even though it doesn't seem like racial preference, the beneficiaries of those are overwhelmingly going to be white. But see, it's not blatant, and so no one complains. And MCRI won't change any of that. You see, we get upset about that which is obvious, but not that which is not obvious. This is why people get upset about Black History Month, because we call it Black History Month. But the fact that April isn't called White History Month doesn't mean it's not, or May, or June, or July, or August, or September. Just because the racial norm isn't named doesn't mean that it isn't racialized. And that's the problem with the MCRI. It only takes us into a discussion of that which is blatant, that which is obvious, not that which is institutionalized. And the point is, it is that institutionalized racial preference for the dominant majority against which affirmative action was intended to be arrayed and to be deployed. Now, you may not think it's the best mechanism, and perhaps it isn't. I've never met a single advocate who believed that it was the best mechanism, let alone the only one. But the question is whether or not any other alternative to eliminating or even beginning to diminish the systemic white racial preference that has existed is being put forward by the proponents of ending what they call racial preference, what I might call affirmative action. And the answer there is that there really is no alternative being proposed in that fashion. Perhaps we can talk about that as the rest of the evening goes on. But the point here is that the MCRI isn't going to touch, isn't going to change, isn't going to eliminate, or even substantially diminish those institutionalized preferences both in state government, in contracting, or the fact that the U of M is going to continue, even though they don't use the point system any longer. They're still going to try and get folks from the UP. They're still going to give preference to people who took AP and honors classes. They're still going to give preference to people with higher SAT scores, in spite of the fact that all the evidence, again, not some, all of the evidence suggests that SATs are not particularly correlated with academic ability, let alone your 4-year grades or your graduation rates. They can explain at best about 17% of the difference between any 2 students in their freshman year and have almost no relationship to anything after that. What they are very highly correlated with is income, however. And so for every $10,000 additional dollars that your family earns, you will on average earn 15 more points on the SAT. Not because money made you smart, but because money ensured the resources to allow you to prepare better for those tests and then be deemed more qualified. Let me suggest to you that if we are going to look at qualifications, we have to look at them holistically. No one is suggesting that there is any interest in letting unqualified people get anything, and indeed that's not what affirmative action does. In the job market, 200 studies have been done on this, And a few years ago, a meta-analysis, which is a fancy term for a study of other people's studies, was done in the Journal of Economic Literature, a publication of the American Economics Association. And those 200 studies they reviewed found that persons who had been given opportunity via affirmative action, who maybe wouldn't have gotten the jobs absent affirmative action, nonetheless, after 2 years of being observed, were performing equal to, if not better, than their white male counterparts, even though they had had, on paper, perhaps, fewer credentials because they'd had fewer opportunities. I got news for you. If you've had more opportunities than me, you're supposed to have a better resume. That's how it goes. But you ought not be rewarded for having that better resume when you're supposed to have it, having been given advantage generation after generation after generation. The same is true for schooling. The same is true for test scores. The same is true for contracting or in any endeavor. I would suggest, in fact, that if you take groups of people in our country who, granted, do not differ in terms of their inherent ability, and Carl and I are definitely on the same page in terms of that. If one of those groups has had a 2-lap or a 3-lap head start in an 8-leg relay race, imagining now that life is like a relay race. I too hate sports metaphors, but this one is a good one. If you take a group of people that has had a 2 or 3-lap head start, and at the end of the 8-leg race, that person that had, or that group that had the head start, still hits the tape first. But perhaps those other groups now are only 1 lap behind, or 1.5 laps behind, so they've closed some of that distance. Not all of it, tantamount to having a test score, for example, that's somewhat lower than someone else, or a GPA that might be somewhat lower, or an AP curriculum that might be somewhat less extensive. Hitting that tape a lap behind, or 1.5 laps behind, when you started out 3 laps behind, 4 laps behind, 5 laps behind, suggests to me that you are indeed the faster runner. Right? Because the person who hit the tape first had a head start. So the idea that we should be admitting on the basis of merit is a nice concept, but how do we define and conceptualize merit? If we are going to conceive of merit as that thing you have, in large part because you had access to the opportunity structure in ways that others didn't, we are rewarding, in effect, an economic and class, and in effect, then racial aristocracy. That is certainly not the intention of either, well, it may have been the intention of the framers, but does it really matter? It's certainly not the intention of those of us who care about justice and equity in the present day. And so ultimately, and I'll obviously respond to Carl's comments more during the formal rebuttal time, but I think what I want to leave you with is this understanding that you really have a choice. And that choice is not about whether you're going to get rid of racial preference or not. If you vote for the MCRI, you will only get rid of those programs and policies that seek to balance out the institutionalized, systematic, ingrained advantages that have always in this country existed for whites. If you vote against the MCRI, you will not eliminate racial preference either. The only way you'll do that is if you join the struggle for racial justice. Thank you very much.